Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions. If we are unable to get to them during the presentation, they will be answered at the end. My name is Maddie Acey, and I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Discovering Your Ancestors Through Military Records. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law at Arizona State University. He served for 2 years as an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army and 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He has previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 32 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren.
Howdy, this is James Tanner. We're here from the Brigham Young University Family History Library, and we're going to talk today about discovering your ancestors through military records. Interesting part about this is that we have a major question, and that is, did your male ancestors live during a war? It's only been recently, of course, that females have had a high profile in any kind of a military conflict. But that doesn't mean they didn't serve. They may have served as far back as even the Revolutionary War, but there were very few. However, the male ancestors, there's much higher probability that they were involved in a conflict if they were there at the time. One thing you do have to remember, for example, is that over a million people died in the American Civil War and in what they call the war between the states. And many, many more people throughout the country were affected by the war. And there's a lot of records. There were a lot of war widows. There was a lot of pension records that were generated, all sorts of things that occurred because of that major conflict. But additionally, there were lots of other wars. So we're going to look a little bit at the wars, and then we're going to look at the types of military records that might have been generated during those different conflicts. If they lived during the war, then the assumption you have to make is that there may be a military record of his participation in the war. You can't assume that they weren't involved. You have to assume that they were involved, and always start looking for military records. So there's it can be quite a process, and it has been complicated until relatively recently, when huge numbers of these records are going online on some of the larger websites. So and there are some major projects in putting in particular war records, such as the War of 1812. There's a huge effort going right now to add records from the War of 1812. Okay, so even if your female ancestors were not involved directly in the war, they may have claimed a pension or gotten married to a veteran after the war, and when that veteran died, then they were entitled to have a pension. Some of these widows lived well into the 20th century. They were still making claims and being paid even up till as late as the 1930s. So it's interesting to find out that this kind of information existed. I mean, you could be a little bit cynical about this, because sometimes there were let's call them younger females who married what you would consider to be quite older military veterans, and you would start to think, well, maybe they did that for other reasons besides the normal ones you would want to do to get married, that maybe they thought they would get a pension. Well, before you start thinking those kinds of things, you need to look at these military pensions. The government, the legislature, changed the amount that was being paid almost every time they went into session. They kind of balanced the federal budget on the military pensions, so they just kept changing the amount that they would get paid. Additionally, from some of the earlier wars, the pension was like $2 a month. So it wasn't like you were going to get rich and famous off of a pension. Okay. So most historians count about, and we say about because there's some disagreement over whether some of these things are wars or not wars. You know, the one that I remember most is the Korean. We call it the Korean War. Most historians are very careful not to use the word war with the Korean conflict. It was a United Nations peacekeeping action. It wasn't a war, according to everybody except the people who were there who think it's a war. And if you were shot in Korea, it was the same as if you were shot some other war. Most historians, so there are 26, and the question I have is, could you name them all off the top of your head? No, I doubt that anybody could. But surprisingly, I've had some experiences with that are pretty interesting. I had a class once where I would kind of generally refer to the class where I had about a half a dozen, let's call them mature adults in the class, people who were not necessarily high school type people, and they were older people. And I started talking about some things that were happening back in the 1860s, and so I said, well, what happened in 1860, 62 to 61, 62, 63, 64, up through 66? And everybody stared at me, and I went, no, come on, tell me what happened in that time period. I mean, this is kind of not a rhetorical question. I try to figure out if, you know, and they just sat there, and I went, you're kidding me. And they said, and I just kept, and finally I said, anybody here recognize the United States Civil War? And they said, oh, is that when that was? Anyway, I'm telling you we're talking here about genealogists and genealogy people and records, and we're trying to find our ancestors, and I think that's kind of the idea of being a genealogist. And so I'm guessing that it would be a good idea if you knew which wars there were and when they happened and whether or not your people were around during those wars, is an idea of trying to find more records about what happened with some of your ancestors. Okay, so can you name all the wars? No. Okay, probably not. So let's look at a list of the ones that are most commonly included in this compilation of wars. And we do go back, and that's kind of a trick question because you talk about wars at the United States. Well, the United States started in 1776, technically, officially in 1782, 83, but uh, there were a lot of wars before that during the colonial times. So first one's called King Philip's War. Some of these may strike a chord of recognition. Some of them may sound like, what? There's King William's War. They just kept changing the kings, obviously, and so they had a war every time. I don't know. Queen Anne, see, every time they changed the monarch, we had another war. Queen Anne's War, King George's War. They all had to have their war. French and Indian War, the Cherokee War, the American Revolution. So we finally get up to the Revolution. So all these were pre-Revolutionary War periods. Now, granted, if your people weren't in the area where the King Philip's War was in upper New England, you probably did not. They probably were not even aware that it was going on. These are mostly wars between the English and the French and the Indians and anyone else that happened to be wandering around in the wilderness at that time. So and mostly Indians. Okay, so there's the Franco-American Naval War, the Barbary Wars, the War of 1812, the Creek War, the War of Texas Independence, Mexican-American War. Now that's a big war, and if you're from a place like I am, mostly from Arizona, you are pretty well aware of the Mexican-American War because before that, the part that I lived in Arizona was part of Mexico, and had we not been involved in that war, we probably would still be living in Mexico, and I would be speaking Spanish instead of English. Probably not, but that's one of the kinds of things that can happen. The U.S. Civil War, which of course I've already mentioned, is a pretty big conflict there. Spanish-American War. Uh, a lot of people get the Mexican War confused with the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was the remember the Maine, Cuba, that kind of thing, the Philippines, um, Teddy Roosevelt, uh, and San Juan Hill and the Rough Riders. That's all Spanish-American. The Mexican-American War was actually most of the generals who participated in that war ended up fighting for the Confederacy in the Civil War. Um, and it was really the training ground for the American officers because they got involved in that war, and then shortly thereafter they were involved in the U.S. Civil War. World War I, World War II, the Korean War. We're getting closer to our time period. Kind of an interesting sidelight. Uh, when I was in school, at high school, and that level of school, uh, we used to have a class called American History, and during the time that I had it, which was about 3 or 4 times, I think, during my whole school career, I don't think we ever made it past the Civil War. So as far as learning about the Spanish American or World War I or II or Korean War, that wasn't part of the deal. So of course, part of the Korean War was happening while I was in school, so that was another thing. Vietnam War, um, Bay of Pigs invasion, remember that one. Grenada, Panama. I remember Panama because I was stationed in Panama, and I was there for a couple of years in the United States Army, and they were always ready, going to go fight with somebody, and they finally did. But after that, it's after I left, so I wasn't really there during that what they call the Panamanian invasion. Panama calls it the Panamanian invasion. We don't call it the Panamanian invasion. Okay, Persian Gulf War, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Afghanistan. Okay, that's all the ones we're listing here. You could probably add a few more if you wanted to. Oh, Iraq. I forgot about Iraq. There we go. That's the list of our wars. Um, every one of those wars generated huge amounts of paper. Now, obviously, the ones that are way back in the past in the colonial days, the amount of records available for those wars is fairly restricted. But the amount of documentary evidence in the American Civil War is just overwhelming. Um, there's always being more published online. Um, they basically online records for the Civil War are are just very, very, very prolific. The interesting thing about the Civil War, however, is in the United States is that most of these records end up in the United States archives. The earlier records do not. The colonial records are not necessarily kept in the archives, but the United States Archives has a huge number of records. But um, one of the things that did happen was back in the 1970s, there was a huge fire at what was called the National Archives Military Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. And many of the records from around 1918 through around 1972 or 73 were destroyed in that fire. It was really a big fire, and so there's some restrictions on the ability to get to some of the records. Most of the people who served in the Army during that period of time have had their records reconstructed. They've reconstructed their service records. But there are other alternative records for finding out about these people. And there were a few more wars, by the way, that I didn't include. So just in case you're wondering. Now, as I mentioned here, there were military records that were produced for each of the records. So we're going to look at the kinds of records that might have been produced in these wars and generally where you would start looking for those records. So the question is where they are. And as I started to explain, the location of the records depends on the date of the war. So the earlier the records, they're going to be in a different location. They're going to be at different locations than the records that were done later in later time periods. Pre-Revolutionary War records, for example, are located in the state and local archives or in Great Britain. Why in Great Britain? Because that was the country and that was the colonies were part of England, part of Great Britain at the time. So the records actually are in Great Britain. They're not even in the United States. And so there's many records out there that might might be located someplace that you wouldn't expect. And there are compilations, by the way, of what we call bibliographies that show where all the records are located. So you can look for lists of where the records are located, as well as the records themselves. Now, after the Revolutionary War, we're in the United States of America, and they're primarily in the United States National Archives up to 1912. As I mentioned, there was a big fire, and a lot of those were lost. Military records may also be in the state and local archives. So if someone served, and a good example of this is my grandfather, he was we knew he had been in World War I. It's interesting though that he left no record at all of his military service as far as what he did or where he went or how he participated. And he fought first in the what's called the Mexican border campaign, and of course I left that off the list. But that was the Pancho Villa had General Pershing and General Patton down there. That was before Patton was a general. And I understand that's where he got his pearl-handled revolvers, was in Mexico. But anyway, they were quite there were a lot of different personalities and people down there on the border. And my grandfather served down in Douglas, Arizona, on the Mexican border. Then he also served in World War I. Well, what we found out was that is a long story, but I could never find any record of his activity in World War I. None of the records of military veterans, none of the standard record places even mentioned the unit that he was in. I mean, eventually, from his headstone, his Veterans Administration headstone, we had the name of the unit. And I was finally able to track that down. And what happened is that he was actually in the Arizona National Guard. Well, technically, he was in the New Mexico National Guard, in the Arizona part of the New Mexico National Guard. And they were then, when he joined for World War I, the National Guard unit was shipped to Texas, and then his Texas National Guard unit was mobilized for the World War I. And so technically, he was never in the Army. He was in the National Guard the whole time. And but he served all the way through up through. Eventually, I was able to find his service records, and it shows that he served all the way up from France, all the way up through the war, up to Germany. So that's probably why I didn't want to talk about it. Now, some of these military records have been digitized and are on major websites, and the one we mention most is Fold 3. It's actually FOLD 3, numeral 3.com. It was previously called, now I've forgotten what it was called previously. Footnote, that's right, footnote.com. And they was purchased by Ancestry, and they changed the name to Fold 3 and also turned it into a military records website. So they have probably one of the largest collections of concentrated records on the military. Good news, they're all there. Bad news, well, not particularly bad news, but it is a subscription website. And no, it is not included in your Ancestry subscription. So if you have an Ancestry subscription, you still have to subscribe to Fold 3. Another good thing about it, though, is that if you have access to a Family History Center, it is one of the what's called portal programs where we have free access at FamilySearch.org, Family History Centers. And another thing that's important to realize is to check the FamilySearch.org Research Wiki. It's on FamilySearch.org under Search, and there's a link to the wiki. and they have the wiki has right now almost 83,000 pages of information about everything about genealogy and a substantial amount of information about military records and their locations. So if you need more specific information, then just log into familysearch.org, go to the research wiki, and type in military records, and you'll get started looking at United States military records and lots of military records from other countries. It's possible that your ancestor served in some other army. Um, I always used to say when I was working with the Boy Scouts, I always used to say uh, that I was born before the war. And finally, one of the scouts, when I said that one time, they said, "Yeah, and he fought for the Confederacy." So I was getting a little older there, but that's kind of what happens when you get old, especially if you're old to a 12-year-old. Um, the, let's kind of go through the major categories of military records, the kinds of things that you might be able to find about your ancestors. First of all, there are what are called compiled service records. Uh, when someone joins the military, the government starts cranking out paper. Uh, they have an enlistment, they have all sorts of different things. The government also creates a whole series of orders telling them where to go, where they're going to serve, how long they're going to serve, and all sorts of things. And as they go along, they keep all these records with the person. So they have what's called a compiled service record that tells everything about that individual's service. Now, for some of the earlier wars, if we're talking about pre-Revolutionary War wars, then those compiled service records are going to turn out to be like 2 pages or 1 page. There's not going to be a whole lot of information, but for the later wars, the more recent they are, the bigger the files of these documents can be. Secondly, you have pension applications. Beginning with the Revolutionary War, the United States government agreed to pay pensions, and that meant that they compensated the veterans uh, who had retired and who made a claim for a pension. The amounts were very small early on, uh, but considering the fact that some of these people lived in areas where any cash was rare at that time in the United States, it was a big deal. And so there were a lot of pensions. The good news for the genealogical researcher is when the government denied the pension application, because then the person would reapply. And sometimes the widows would reapply after the veteran died. And as they kept reapplying and asking for more information and more information, you will find some of these files are more than an inch thick, like 2 or 1 inches thick, and they have everything from Bible records. They have affidavits from neighbors. They've sent them all sorts of things, all sorts of information that gets into these pension files. Now, where are these pension files? Well, part of them, some of them are now being digitized and are available on the larger websites. Family Search has some, Ancestry has some of the other websites, Online Fold 3 obviously, have some of these pension file applications, but still the bulk of this paper is still sitting in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., except for those records that were lost in the St. Louis fire. I don't think any pension records were lost. I think that was mostly service records. Pension payment records, that's another type of record. The government kept track of all the payments were made and to whom they were made. Um, One of the good things about this is that you're often able to find the spouse's, the wife's maiden name from these records, because her brothers and sisters will all come in and give affidavits and say, I am the brother of so and so, and I know that they were married and she lived with him for, however many years and things like that. So these records are valuable for a lot of reasons in giving information about the families. In fact, some people comments that I've had made are that the pension records are more valuable than almost any other records they've found. Now, that brings up kind of an interesting question in my own family lines because my great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. Uh, and That's how old I am, and it's only 2 generations away from the Civil War. Figure that out. But anyway, the, uh, uh, the problem I see is that his wife never did get a pension, and I don't have any record at all or any mention at all that she may have gotten a pension. So I've always wondered why she didn't apply for a pension. She could have used it. Bounty land applications. Now, bounty land applications are a completely different issue. Um, Starting with the Revolutionary War, because the United States government didn't necessarily have any cash, they would award people land. Now, the government had a lot of land, and especially after the Louisiana Purchase and some of the other um, land acquisitions of the government, the the amount of land that they had compared to the amount of cash they had on hand was a big difference. So they came up with a scheme of paying the soldiers with land warrants. So if you were private, you got like 20 acres of land. If you were, I don't remember the exact numbers. They changed that constantly, by the way. So there's no way to really say exactly how much they got because they, like I said, every time the legislature would go into session, the U.S. legislature, they would change the amount of the pensions and change the amount of the bounty land warrants. So you really have to have kind of a chart that shows you for each year how much they would get. Um, but in each case, they would get this warrant, which would be a piece of paper that said you're entitled to X number of acres of land, depending on whether you were a private or a sergeant or a captain or whatever, an officer. Generals got like 600 acres and so forth. And these bounty land warrants, of course, some of the soldiers, in fact, most of the soldiers, it turned out, didn't really want the land. They weren't interested in packing up their families and moving out into the forest. They wanted to stay where they were. So they would sell their land warrants. So there were land speculators out there who were out there buying up the land warrants. And eventually, what happened with these land warrants, which were pieces of paper like a security, like a stock certificate, that were valuable because they could be turned into a certain amount of land. It's like a homestead in effect, but they were entitled to it, and they could use that to purchase whatever land was made available by the government at the time. And there was actually a stock market. There was like a securities market where they had a pricing and everything, and people speculated on that market on these bounty land warrants for a long time. Well, an interesting thing that happened to me a couple of years ago, I was helping patrons down in the Mesa Family Search Library, and somebody walked in and said, "I have this deed for my grandfather, great grandfather, or whatever, and it's in Davis County, Utah, which is just north of Provo here, a couple of few miles north. And the name on this deed is from somebody we don't even know who this person is, and we don't have any idea how my grandfather got this land and who these people are. And this is his farm. We know it was his farm. Okay, so we started talking about it. Well, we investigated this a couple of hours later when we'd go through everything that I could think of. We discovered, in a matter of fact, that this was a piece of property that had been purchased by a bounty land warrant. This was in the 1930s in Davis County, Utah, and it was purchased with a bounty land warrant from the War of 1812. So that document had been floating around for more than 100 years, waiting for somebody to purchase to get land from the government. And as a matter of fact, I think they probably got the last bit of federal land that they ever allowed anybody to purchase with a bounty land warrant because they kind of shut it down and the way they did the homesteads. Okay, so these are kind of interesting things to track, and there are ways that you can get there. You have draft, conscription, and selective service records. Of course, the draft began in the Civil War. Conscription and selective service all were parts of the wars after the Civil War. World War I draft registration cards are extremely useful in helping. I've used those to locate people that otherwise we had no records of where they lived originally, who they were, where they were. And there's most of those the World War I and World War II draft registration records are on FamilySearch.org, Ancestry, and probably on MyHeritage. I don't remember if they are or not, but they're basically those are kind of like census records. They're just standardized records that everybody wants to look at. And it gives a good idea because virtually every male in the United States was registered in World War I, either at the first registration or the second registration, and then in World War II it happened again. And many people show up in both registrations because they were young enough, old enough to get into World War I, and they were still not old enough to get out of being registered in World War II. And they did go back and re-register some of the older people when they got worried about the wars going on and on and on forever. Cemetery records. Veterans are entitled to a burial um, uh, amount. They get paid. The government will pay a veteran. And if, for instance, if you have an older relative and they die and they were a veteran of war, you need to keep that in mind because they can apply and receive the veteran benefit from for a cemetery to help to purchase the cemetery plot. Or they may be entitled to be buried in a national cemetery. Um, Sometimes people don't particularly care for that because the national cemetery may not be close to where they want to have their people buried. But that is another option. And a third option is that they can have a apply for and have the government pay for a grave marker, a tombstone for the veteran's grave. That's how I found out some information about my grandfather. It's also how I found out later that the cemetery uh, Veterans Administration cemetery marker application had his entire military record written on a 3x5 card. So it was quite an interesting find. Okay, so now in compiled service records, first of all, there are things called muster rolls, and a muster roll is that every day the unit had to submit a record saying how many people were present for duty, how many people were on sick leave, how many people were on other details doing something else, because the Army always needed to know, especially during wartime, how many people were available to actually fight if they wanted to uh, direct a unit to some place where they were going to go fight. Returns are back and forth information on the rolls, uh, orders and things that went back and forth after they had submitted rolls. Pay vouchers, obviously, the soldiers were paid. Um, it's always kind of tragic in a sense from our standpoint to see how little most of them were paid over the years, but that was uh, that was just the way things were. Enlistment papers, obviously, they had to fill out where they were, and if your person was, and interestingly enough, a lot of people who came to America, a lot of the immigrants enlisted in the Army because during various war times, they gave the veterans preferential immigration status. So they were able to become citizens either more quickly instead of waiting the 5 years that was the time limit during much of the history of this problem. They sometimes during some of the wars they actually could become citizens because they were soldiers, and other times they got sort of expedited uh, citizenship actions. So it really didn't, you can't say, well, my grandfather, my great grandfather, whoever was an immigrant, and he probably didn't fight in the war. And the answer is he may have, because he may have been had an incentive to go fight. Discharge papers, obviously, you like to find out that they were honorably discharged. If they weren't, there's going to be a lot of other stuff in there too. So you might want to find out what happened to the person. You might just find out that your ancestor walked away. Uh, it didn't. It happened quite frequently in some of the earlier wars. They were on enlistments for a very short period of time. Sometimes their enlistment was only a matter of weeks instead of years. And when they were through, the government didn't necessarily want them to leave, but they just picked up and walked away. So, it's just kind of an interesting situation. Day reports. Um, every day, each unit had to file a report of what went on with the report, where they went, what the results were with their action, and anything that might have happened during the day that they wanted to that needed to be drawn to the attention of the commanding officers. Okay, so in addition to that, once they were out of the Army or Navy or wherever, Marines or wherever they fought, the pension applications and pension payment records then become an important issue because the files contain, as I mentioned, narratives of events during service, marriage certificates, birth records, death certificates, pages from family Bibles, family letters, depositions of witnesses, affidavits, discharge papers, everything. They're just basically it was a discussion between the veteran and the the person claiming usually a person of what we would call in the law a putative widow, somebody who was alleging that they were the widow of a veteran. Now, it wasn't unusual, by the way, that people were trying to say they were the veteran of a widow of a veteran, and they were not. That did happen. Uh, and so, even if your ancestor wasn't in the war, it's very possible that his wife tried to claim a pension. So it's just a matter of making a search. This is just one more place where we go to look for records. I mentioned bounty land applications. Uh, they were mainly they were issued between 1775 and March 3rd of 1855. So you don't see too many of those outside of that time period. That was primarily the war that was in that period of time would have been the Revolutionary Wars and the War of 1812. So would be the two big conflicts that would deal with. Draft conscription or selective service records began in 1863, and the registration cards give the man's names, residence, age, occupation, marital status, birthplace, physical description, and other information. Um, Sometimes they list the dependents, sometimes they don't. Um, uh, the occupation records are interesting because those records are not usually something that you find, although the U.S. Census records will sometimes say occupation and they'll say, farm worker or something like that. These draft registration cards will sometimes tell the name of the business they worked for, which gives you a place to go look for records. So it's pretty important to examine these carefully and make sure you find all these for everyone who had to register either beginning in 1863. Cemetery records can contain a lot of information, especially if they're buried in a national cemetery. The cemetery record may have more information about their service than you obtain in other places. Um, and we have a thing called the Department of Veterans Affairs, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Nationwide Gravesite Locator. And this is an online website that you can go in there and search for veterans' names and hopefully find the of the grave where they're buried. Now, this was going back to my grandfather's service. This was what's interesting to me is he doesn't show up in the National Gravesite Locator. That was another issue that I had, is that I had it right there in front of me. Well, I looked at it. His Veterans Administration grave marker, tombstone, and yet he was not listed in the gravesite locator. So that was another reason why it was kind of strange, and it was not surprising to find out that he was in the National Guard and not in the Army. There's the website. It's easier to find by going to Nationwide Gravesite Locator or Veterans Grave Sites or any of those terms, and you'll find it immediately. Okay, so there are many more records, both online and in libraries, archives, and other repositories. You just have to keep looking. Now, here's one of the things that I have found. For the major wars, if you start back for the Korean War and the World War II and World War I, and back into the Spanish-American War and even the Civil War, what you will find is that there are detailed, and I mean really detailed, military history of of every unit that ever fought in one of those wars. If you want to dig for it, you can find a military history of the unit where your person served, and you may very well mention the name of that person, your ancestor's name in that history. Now, where are you going to go if you know you look online, and by the way, there's lots of them online. They're just it's unbelievable how many different unit histories you can find online. But let's say you don't find that unit history. Well, the way to do that is to look at the branch of the service that they were in. Of course, obviously, we have the Navy and the Army, and later on we have Marines and we have a Coast Guard, and we have the Air Force and all that sort of stuff. Well, here's the situation. Uh, if you can kind of narrow it down to what branch of the service they served in, and start working on and find the the unit that they were in, then you may be able to find that these many places where the school is, where the branch headquarters is of the Army, not just branch of the service, but branch of the Army. So the Army, you could have armor, artillery. In the old days, it would be cavalry, and artillery and armor would be the cavalry. And then you'd have all these different branches of the service. You know, the engineers, you had military intelligence, you had all sorts of different branches. Now, each one of those has its own headquarters. So, for example, armor, which is the tanks, the armor school and the armor is in Fort Knox, Kentucky. And so Fort Knox, Kentucky has a big museum, and they have the histories of all the units. So you can go there to Fort Knox and go to the museum, and you can do research. Before you give up on this, you should try to figure out where they might have served, what branch they were in, and check out like the infantry school, Fort Benning, or the artillery school, or the Air Force, different Air Force, the Air Force academies, and things like that. Those are things. And if if your ancestor was an officer, if they were someone who graduated from military academy, then there are definitely going to be a lot of records at the military academy about their schooling, their service, and everything else that happened to them, because they were followed very carefully by the military academies. They wanted to keep track of all their graduates, so everybody they all know about these people. So these are, once you get into the military records, you begin to realize that there's sort of a huge web of records out there that are created and potentially can give a lot of information about individuals. Now, what are your private, your guy that's down on the line and may have only been in the Army for a short period of time? There may not be a whole lot more than a few pieces of paper or a 3x5 card or something, but many of these people have rather extensive military records. Now, don't forget the books. One of the things that happens here is that these military histories get published. Um, they automatically have a market. People are interested. Everybody wants to know. Researchers want to know what happened during the war. Historians. We have a tendency to think that genealogists, that people do things for us. They actually don't. Nobody seems to do much for genealogies. Uh, but these records were not kept because of genealogists. They were kept because of military historians, because of the people who were researching the wars, and because the United States government keeps stuff. So basically, you have to understand that these military histories and other things can be in a lot of books. And as I mentioned, there are histories of nearly every unit and nearly every war. So if you just dig in there and do some good research, you'll find probably find a history of the military unit. And the whole idea here is to keep looking because these categories of military records are, for instance, the bounty land warrants, and maybe in time could be completely disassociated with the military conflict. As I mentioned with the example here in Davis County, Utah, it could be many, many years after the original uh, veteran received that bounty land warrant before it was ever used to purchase the property. And yet the person, the original purchaser is on that land warrant, and there's probably a land warrant application that could be that you could find for that particular transaction. So it's very important to keep looking. You may be able to find information that you know you would never discover in any other way. And if nothing more, it is extremely interesting and gives you some insight into what your ancestor may have had to go through, especially if they were involved in a major conflict like the Civil War or World War I or World War II. They may have some really good stories there. One thing I did find out at one point in time, I was running a Korean War website for memories of this Korean War, and I found that it was very common that the children of the veterans had never heard anything about what their father or their uncle or whoever did when they were in the war, because the people would simply not talk about it. But that that is, that sometimes we have to go back to these records to reconstruct what it is that they actually did, because they didn't leave any records themselves. Once they were out of the army, they didn't ever want to talk about it or think about it or even go back there again. So they were kind of shut it out of their minds. Well, thank you for watching another BYU Family History Library webinar. We're planning those in the future. If you go to the BYU Family History Library website, in the upper right-hand corner of the web page, there's a link to all of our resources. These webinars are recorded and will be put up on youtube.com, on Google's YouTube, for review by people in the future.